Sometimes the deepest pain shows itself on the outside, marking us in ways that make others turn away. Arthur Henley knew this better than most. His face had become a map of grief that no one wanted to read. The former music teacher had been hiding for 3 years in the small coastal town of Millbrook. Brown, crusted growths covered his face like a mask. People avoided him on the street. They whispered about the night his wife died in a house fire. They wondered what secrets he was hiding. When Arthur finally walked into the town clinic, everyone looked away. Everyone except Maya, a nurse who understood pain. She had lost someone too. What she did next shocked everyone in that room. She reached out and gently touched his face. What did Maya see that no one else could? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The small wooden music box sat silent on Arthur Henley's kitchen table, its delicate melody of Clair de Lune trapped behind a mechanism he no longer had the heart to wind. Eleanor had loved that song. They had danced to it on their wedding night 43 years ago, and again on their last anniversary before the fire took her away. Arthur's cottage on Maple Street had once been filled with music. Piano lessons echoing from the front parlor, children's laughter spilling onto the wraparound porch, Eleanor's warm voice calling everyone to stay for dinner. Now the house held only silence and shadows, the piano bench pushed against the wall, its lid closed like a coffin. He caught his reflection in the hallway mirror as he shuffled toward the front door. The brown growths had spread again overnight, forming new crusts along his jawline. They didn't hurt, not physically, but each new formation felt like another layer of shame, another reason for the world to turn away. The dermatologist in the next town had run every test imaginable 3 years ago. Stress-related, he'd concluded with clinical detachment. Psychological manifestation of grief. Time will heal it. Time had done no such thing. Arthur pulled his wool cap low over his forehead and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face before stepping onto the porch. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was watering her garden. She glanced up, saw him, and quickly looked away, busying herself with her roses. He understood. Who wanted to look at a monster? The walk to Millbrook's small medical clinic took 15 minutes through the town's historic district. Arthur remembered when he used to make this journey easily, stopping to chat with shopkeepers, former students, neighbors. Now he moved like a ghost through streets where he'd once belonged, past the music store where he'd bought Eleanor's anniversary gift, past the cafe where they'd shared Sunday breakfast for 2 decades. Maya Rodriguez had arrived in Millbrook 6 months ago, though Arthur only knew this from overheard conversations at the post office. She'd come from somewhere in California, the postmaster had mentioned, a widow looking for a quieter life by the ocean. Arthur understood that need. Sometimes you had to run from the places that held too much pain. The clinic's waiting room fell silent when Arthur entered that Tuesday morning. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, magazines lowered, children moved closer to their mothers. He'd grown accustomed to this reaction, but it never stopped stinging. He approached the reception desk where Janet Morrison, whom he'd taught in 7th grade, avoided his eyes. "I have an appointment," he said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Of course, Mr. Henley. Please have a seat." Janet's professional courtesy couldn't mask her discomfort. Arthur chose a chair in the corner, pulling his scarf higher. He studied his hands, once strong and graceful, capable of coaxing beauty from piano keys and guiding young fingers across. Strings. Now they were gnarled with arthritis and shame. Eleanor's voice echoed in his memory from that last terrible night. "Arthur, please, let me go. I'm tired, my love. So very tired." But he'd fought the flames anyway, tried to reach her, screamed her name until his throat bled. The fireman had pulled him back just as the roof collapsed. "Mr. Henley?" Arthur looked up to see a woman in scrubs standing in the doorway. She was perhaps in her mid-50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her face held no revulsion, no fear, only professional calm tinged with something that looked like recognition. I'm Maya Rodriguez, the new nurse. Dr. Harrison is running behind, so I'll be doing your initial assessment." Arthur followed her down the hallway, aware of the whispers that started up behind him. Maya's office was small but warm, decorated, with photographs of ocean sunsets and a small succulent garden on the windowsill. "Please have a seat," Maya said, settling behind her desk with his thin file. "I see it's been some time since your last visit." 3 years. Arthur kept his scarf in place. "And what brings you in today?" Arthur gestured helplessly toward his face. "It's getting worse. I thought maybe—" He stopped, unsure what he'd actually thought. That medicine might cure what felt like punishment? That someone might look at him without disgust? Maya set down the file and leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Henley, would it be all right if I examined the affected areas? I'd like to get a better understanding of what we're dealing with." Arthur hesitated, then slowly unwound his scarf. Maya's expression didn't change. She moved around the desk and gently tilted his chin toward the window light. Her touch was professional but not clinical. There was warmth in it, a quality Arthur hadn't felt in years. "These formations," she said thoughtfully, "they're quite unusual. Tell me, when did they first appear?" "Right after Eleanor died. My wife. There was a fire." Maya's hand stilled for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss." Something in her voice made Arthur look up. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own grief, the kind that comes from losing someone who was part of your soul. "You understand," he said, not quite a question. "I do." Maya returned to her chair. "Loss changes us in ways we don't expect. Sometimes our bodies carry what our hearts can't hold." For the first time in 3 years, Arthur felt seen rather than judged. "The town thinks I killed her, that I didn't try hard enough to save her. What do you think?" The question hung in the air like a bridge Arthur wasn't sure he could cross. "I think they might be right." Maya made a note in his file. "Mr. Henley, I'd like to see you again next week. There are some treatments we might explore, but more importantly, I think you need someone to talk to, someone who understands that healing isn't just about medicine." As Arthur rewound his scarf, he felt something shift inside him, not hope exactly, but maybe the faintest possibility of it. "Why are you being kind to me?" Maya smiled and it reached her eyes. "Because everyone deserves kindness, especially when they're carrying more than they can bear alone." Arthur left the clinic with his first appointment in 3 years, and for the first time since Eleanor died, he didn't feel completely invisible. Maya Rodriguez had looked at him, really looked, and hadn't turned away. In a world that had written him off as lost, she'd offered him something he'd forgotten existed, the chance to be human again. That evening, Arthur sat at his kitchen table staring at Eleanor's music box. His finger hovered over the tiny key that would bring Claire de Lune back to life. For 3 years, the silence had felt like respect for Eleanor's memory. Now it felt like prison. He turned the key once, twice, 3 times. The melody began to play, delicate and haunting, filling the empty rooms with remembered love. Arthur closed his eyes and let himself remember dancing with Eleanor in this very kitchen, her head on his shoulder, both of them believing they had all the time in the world. Maybe Maya was right. Maybe healing wasn't just about medicine. Maybe it started with remembering that beneath the pain and shame, love still lived. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. Arthur's hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, fingers finding the charred photograph that had lived there for 3 years. The edges were blackened and brittle. The image faded, but he could still make out their faces, his and Eleanor's, captured at their 40th anniversary dinner just 2 weeks before the fire. They looked so happy, so unaware of what was coming. Eleanor's smile was radiant, her hand resting over his on the white tablecloth. Arthur's eyes were crinkled with laughter at something she'd just whispered. He pulled the photograph out slowly, careful not to let it crumble completely. This was why he'd finally come back to the clinic, not because the growths were getting worse, though they were. Not because he hoped for a cure, though part of him still did. He'd come because Maya Rodriguez had looked at him like he was still human, and humans deserved to tell their stories, even the painful ones. The waiting room was fuller today, Mrs. Patterson with her persistent cough, young Tommy Chen with what looked like a broken wrist, old Mr. Volkov reading yesterday's newspaper through thick glasses. Arthur chose the same corner chair, pulling his scarf up to his eyes. The familiar rustle of discomfort rippled through the room as people noticed him. Shouldn't they have special appointments for people like that? Mrs. Patterson whispered too. Her daughter, not quite quietly enough. "Mom, please," the daughter replied, but she moved her purse to the chair between them and Arthur, creating a barrier. Arthur stared at his lap, heat rising in his chest. For 3 years, he'd endured these reactions without defending himself. What was the point? They'd already decided who he was and what he'd done. The truth wouldn't matter now. "Mr. Henley." Maya's voice cut through his spiral of shame. She stood in the doorway, professional and calm, showing no reaction to the room's tension. "Ready for your appointment?" He followed her down the hallway, acutely aware of the conversations resuming behind them. Maya's office looked different today. She'd added a small lamp that cast warm light instead of the harsh fluorescence, and the scent of lavender drifted from a diffuser on her desk. "How are you feeling?" she asked as they settled into their chairs. "The same." Arthur kept his scarf in place. "Maybe worse. Would you mind if I take a look?" Arthur hesitated, then slowly unwound the fabric. Maya leaned forward, studying his face with careful attention. Her expression remained neutral, clinical but not cold. He watched her eyes, looking for the moment she'd pull back in disgust or fear. It never came. "The inflammation seems more pronounced today," she observed. "Have you been under additional stress?" Arthur almost laughed. When wasn't he under stress? Every trip to the grocery store was an ordeal. Every glimpse of his reflection was a reminder of his failure. Every night was filled with dreams of fire and Eleanor's voice calling his name. "I brought something," he said instead, reaching into his pocket. His fingers found the photograph and he pulled it out with infinite care. "This is Eleanor, my wife." Maya took the damaged photo gently, handling it like the precious thing it was. She studied it for a long moment, and Arthur saw her expression soften. "You both look so happy," she said quietly. "We were. That was taken 2 weeks before." Arthur's voice caught. "Before she died. Tell me about that night." The words Arthur had kept locked inside for 3 years began to pour out. There was a storm. The power had been flickering all evening, and Eleanor was nervous about the old wiring. She'd been asking me to call an electrician for months, but I kept putting it off. "Too busy with lessons," I said. "Too expensive right now." Maya listened without judgment, her hands folded in her lap. I fell asleep in my chair watching the news. When I woke up, there was smoke everywhere. The kitchen was already engulfed. Arthur's voice became a whisper. "I found Eleanor in our bedroom. She was conscious but trapped under a fallen beam. The heat was God. The heat was like nothing I'd ever felt." He closed his eyes, but the memories played behind his lids like a movie he couldn't stop watching. I tried to lift the beam, but it wouldn't budge. Eleanor looked at me and said, "Arthur, please, let me go. I'm tired, my love, so very tired." But I wouldn't listen. I kept trying to move the beam, kept screaming for help. What happened then? The fire department arrived. They had to drag me away from her. I fought them, screamed that I could save her, that I just needed more time. But the roof collapsed before... Arthur's voice broke completely. Maya handed him a box of tissues, waiting patiently for him to continue. The whole town came to the funeral. They brought casseroles and flowers and kind words. But I could see it in their eyes. The questions. Why didn't he get her out? Why didn't he try harder? Why didn't he die trying to save her? "Is that what you think, that you didn't try hard enough?" Arthur touched the growths on his face, feeling their rough texture. "I know I didn't. Eleanor begged me to let her go, and part of me, the selfish part, was relieved. I was tired too, tired of watching her fade away. Fade away? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Arthur realized he'd said more than he intended, revealed something he'd kept hidden even from himself. She hadn't been herself for months before the fire. Forgetting things, getting confused, sleeping all the time. I told myself it was just stress, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I was terrified of what the doctors might tell us, so I pretended it wasn't happening. Maya leaned back in her chair, pieces clicking into place. Arthur, did Eleanor ever see a doctor about these symptoms? I kept meaning to schedule an appointment, but she seemed better some days, and I convinced myself I was imagining things. Then the fire happened, and it didn't matter anymore. It matters, Maya said firmly. It matters very much. For the first time since entering her office, Arthur looked directly at Maya. Why are you being so kind to me? Everyone else in this town thinks I'm a monster. Because I know what it's like to lose someone and feel responsible. My husband died in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. But for months afterward, I convinced myself I could have prevented it somehow. If I'd made David leave work 5 minutes earlier, if I'd insisted he take a different route, if I'd called him and delayed his trip home, the list was endless. Arthur stared at her. But that's different. You couldn't have known. Neither could you. Guilt is a liar, Arthur. It convinces us we had more power than we actually possessed. It makes us responsible for things beyond our control. Arthur felt something shift inside him, like a door that had been locked for years, suddenly cracking open. But the town needs someone to blame, because random tragedy is too frightening to accept. It's easier to believe you failed Eleanor than to admit that sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all. Maya stood and moved to the window, looking out at the parking lot where people went about their normal lives, unaware of the conversation happening inside. I want to help you, Arthur, but first you need to decide if you're ready to stop punishing yourself. Arthur stared at the photograph in his lap, at Eleanor's face frozen in a moment of pure happiness. What would she think of what he'd become? Would she recognize the man who'd loved her for 40 years in this broken creature who couldn't even look at his own reflection? I don't know how to stop, he whispered. Maya returned to her seat. We start small. We start with truth. And we start with the understanding that healing isn't something you do alone. She opened his file and made several notes. I want to see you twice a week from now on. We're going to work on both the physical symptoms and what's causing them. But Arthur, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you won't give up. Not on getting better. And not on yourself. You've been carrying this burden alone. For 3 years, it's time to put it down. Arthur looked at the photograph one more time, then carefully placed it back in his pocket. For the first time in 3 years, the weight of it felt different. Not lighter exactly, but somehow more bearable. I promise, he said, and meant it. As Arthur left the clinic that day, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Eleanor died. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, like a candle flame in a storm, but it was real. Maya Rodriguez had offered him something no one else had, the possibility that he wasn't beyond saving after all. Behind him, the waiting room buzzed with whispered speculation about his longer-than-usual appointment. Let them talk, Arthur thought. For the first time in 3 years, he had something more important to focus on than their judgment. He had work to do. Maya found the letter 3 days after Arthur's breakthrough session. Tucked inside, a medical journal Eleanor had donated to the clinic's small library years ago. The envelope was addressed to Margaret, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, the return address showing the Henley cottage on Maple Street. The postmark was dated just 4 days before the fire. Maya hesitated before opening it. This felt like intruding on private grief, but something told her the letter might hold answers that could help Arthur heal. She unfolded the cream-colored stationery, recognizing the same careful script from the return address. My dearest sister, it began, I'm writing this letter knowing I may never send it, but I need to put these words somewhere before they consume me entirely. Arthur doesn't know I'm struggling as much as I am. How can I tell the man who has loved me so completely for 40 years that I'm disappearing piece by piece? Maya's breath caught. She continued reading. The forgetting is getting worse. Yesterday, I couldn't remember how to make coffee. Coffee, Margaret, something I've done every morning for decades. Arthur pretended not to notice when I put salt in the sugar bowl, but I saw the worry in his eyes. He's been carrying so much already with his increased teaching load since the school budget cuts. I can't add this burden to his shoulders. The letter went on for 2 pages, documenting Eleanor's growing confusion, her fear of becoming a burden, her desperate attempts to hide her symptoms from Arthur. The final paragraph made Maya's chest tighten with understanding. I've made an appointment with Dr. Brennan for next week, but I'm terrified of what he'll tell me. Arthur's mother died of Alzheimer's when he was 30, and it nearly broke him, watching her fade away. I can't ask him to go through that again with me. If the news is what I fear it will be, I may not have the courage to share it with him. Some truths are too heavy for love to bear. The letter was signed simply, Your frightened sister, Eleanor. Maya sat back in her chair, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Eleanor's behavior that Arthur had described, the fatigue, confusion, withdrawal, weren't just stress or depression. They were early signs of cognitive decline that Eleanor had recognized and tried to hide. The appointment with Dr. Brennan had never happened because the fire occurred first. This changed everything. Arthur's guilt over not trying hard enough to save Eleanor took on a completely different meaning when viewed through this lens. Eleanor's final words, "Let me go. I'm tired, my love. So very tired," weren't just about the physical trapped state she was in. They were about a woman who may have already been grieving her own mental decline, who saw the fire as a release from a future she couldn't bear to face. Maya looked up Arthur's next appointment. Tomorrow, at 10 o'clock. She carefully placed Eleanor's letter in his file, knowing she'd need to handle this revelation with extreme delicacy. Arthur had been punishing himself for 3 years based on incomplete information. Learning the truth might set him free, or it might destroy him entirely. That evening, Maya walked the familiar path along Millbrook's shoreline, trying to process what she'd discovered. The fog was rolling in from the Pacific, wrapping the coastal town in a grey embrace that muffled sound and softened edges. She found herself thinking about her own husband, David, about the secrets people kept, even from those they loved most. David had been having chest pains for weeks before his accident, but he'd hidden them from her, not wanting to worry her during her own stressful period at the hospital. She'd only learned about them after his death, when his co-worker mentioned David's request for the name of a cardiologist. Would knowing have changed anything? Would an earlier diagnosis have prevented the heart attack that caused him to lose control of his car? These were the questions that haunted surviving spouses, the what-ifs and if-onlys that could drive a person to madness if they let them. Arthur had been living in that space for 3 years, not knowing that Eleanor had been protecting him from a truth she thought would break him. The next morning, Arthur arrived at the clinic precisely on time, his scarf wrapped tight, despite the mild October weather. Maya noticed the growths on his face seemed slightly less inflamed, though still prominent. Sometimes the body began healing before the mind was ready to let go of its pain. "How have you been sleeping?" Maya asked as they settled into their usual chairs. "Better," Arthur admitted. "Still have the dreams, but they're not as intense." "Tell me about the dreams." Arthur was quiet for a moment, considering. "It's always the same. I'm trying to reach Eleanor through the smoke and flames, but no matter how hard I run, the distance between us keeps growing. She's calling my name, but her voice gets fainter and fainter until I can't hear it anymore." Maya nodded, making notes. "In these dreams, what is Eleanor's expression when you see her?" "Sad, but not afraid. It's strange. She looks more sad for me than for herself." Maya felt the weight of Eleanor's letter in Arthur's file. "Arthur, I found something that I think you need to see. It might be difficult, but it could also help you understand what Eleanor was going through in those final weeks. She handed him the letter, watching his face as he recognized his wife's handwriting. Arthur's hands began to shake as he read, his breathing becoming shallow. Maya was ready to intervene if he became overwhelmed, but Arthur read the entire letter in silence, tears streaming down his cheeks. She knew, he whispered finally. She knew something was wrong and she was trying to protect me, it appears. So Eleanor was dealing with something she found too frightening to share, even with you. Arthur looked up, his eyes red but somehow clearer than Maya had seen them. All this time, I thought she gave up, because I wasn't enough, because I wasn't worth fighting for. Arthur, Eleanor's final words weren't about giving up on you. They were about a woman who was already grieving the loss of herself, who may have seen the fire as a mercy rather than a tragedy. Arthur folded the letter carefully, holding it like the precious artifact it was. She was always protecting people. Her students at the elementary school, neighborhood kids who had problems at home, me, especially me. I should have seen she was protecting me from this too. You saw what she wanted you to see. That's what people who love us do. They carry their burdens alone so we don't have to share the weight. But I was her husband. I should have insisted she see a doctor. I should have pushed harder when I noticed the changes. Maya leaned forward. Arthur, even if you had pushed, even if Eleanor had gotten a diagnosis, would it have changed what happened that night? Would it have prevented the fire or made the rescue easier? Arthur considered this, really considered it, for the first time. In 3 years. No, the fire was an accident. The electrical problem wasn't connected to Eleanor's health. That's right. And Eleanor's cognitive issues, if that's what they were, wouldn't have made her any less trapped under that beam. You did everything humanly possible to save her. She asked me to let her go. And maybe, knowing what we know now, that was her final act of love, saving you from years of watching her disappear the way your mother did. Arthur sat quietly for several minutes, processing this new understanding. Maya watched him carefully, seeing something shift in his posture, his expression. The rigid tension he'd carried for 3 years was beginning to loosen. I miss her so much, he said finally. Of course you do, but maybe now you can miss her without hating yourself. When Arthur left the clinic that day, Maya noticed he walked differently, still slowly, still carefully, but without the hunched shoulders of a man expecting the world to strike him down. It would take time, but she could see the beginnings of healing in the way he held his head, just a little higher. Change was coming to Arthur Henley and to the small town that had forgotten how to show mercy. Maya could feel it in the air, like the promise of rain after a long drought. The yellowed newspaper clipping had been taped inside Arthur's medicine cabinet for 3 years, a daily reminder of his perceived failure. Maya discovered it during her second home visit when Arthur had mentioned feeling dizzy and she'd offered to check his medications. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Local teacher's wife dies in house fire," and beneath it, a photograph of the Henley cottage engulfed in flames. Maya read the article with growing dismay. The reporter had gotten nearly everything wrong. They claimed Eleanor had been overcome by smoke while sleeping, when Arthur had told Maya she was awake and trapped. They suggested Arthur had escaped uninjured, ignoring his severe burns and smoke inhalation. Most damaging of all, they quoted an unnamed neighbor saying, "It's strange he got out, but she didn't. Makes you wonder." "Arthur," Maya said gently, "may I ask why you keep this?" Arthur emerged from the kitchen where he'd been making tea, his movements still careful and deliberate. The growths on his face had continued to improve since learning about Eleanor's letter, but they remained visible, a physical manifestation of 3 years of self-punishment. "To remember," he said simply, "to make sure I never forget what I failed to do. But this article, it's full of inaccuracies. This isn't what really happened." Arthur settled into his worn armchair. The same one where he'd fallen asleep the night of the fire. "Does it matter? The whole town read it, that's what they believe." Maya studied the article again, noting the byline. Jerry Walsh, a reporter who'd since moved to a larger paper in Portland, She'd heard his name around town. Apparently he'd had a reputation for sensationalizing stories to make them more dramatic. Arthur, what if people knew the truth? What if they understood what Eleanor was going through, what you both were dealing with? Who would believe it now? It's been 3 years. They've made up their minds about who I am. Maya sat on the couch across from him, Eleanor's music box between them on the coffee table. Arthur had begun winding it occasionally, filling his cottage with Claire de Lune during their sessions. The melody seemed to calm him, connecting him to happier memories. "Tell me about your marriage," Maya said, "before the last few months. What was it like?" Arthur's expression softened. "Eleanor was my whole world. We met when we were both 24. I was just starting at the high school, and she was teaching 2nd grade at the elementary. Someone at a faculty party said we should meet because we were both musical. I played piano, she sang in the church choir." He paused, lost in the memory. "Our first date was a disaster. I took her to a concert at the college and it rained so good we got soaked running to my car. Then my car wouldn't start. We sat there in the parking lot for 2 hours, waiting for my brother to come jump the battery. But Eleanor just laughed about it. She said later that she knew I was the one because I didn't get angry or embarrassed. I just made the best of it." "What made your marriage strong?" "We were partners in everything. Teaching, music, life decisions. We talked through everything together. Eleanor had this way of seeing the good in people, especially the difficult ones. When I'd get frustrated with a struggling student, she'd help me find a different approach. She made me a better teacher, a better person." Maya could hear the love in Arthur's voice, even shadowed by grief. This was the man Eleanor had tried to protect, the one she couldn't bear to burden with knowledge of her declining mind. "Arthur, I think Eleanor was still being your partner in those final months, even though you didn't realize it. She was trying to handle her fears alone so you wouldn't have to carry them. But marriages are supposed to be about sharing everything, good and bad. I failed her by not seeing what she was going through. Or maybe she succeeded in protecting you from something." She wasn't ready to face herself. Maya reached for her purse and pulled out a folder. "I've been doing some research on cognitive decline, particularly early onset symptoms. What Eleanor described in her letter, the confusion, memory lapses, fatigue, they're classic early signs. But here's what's important. People in the early stages often become very good at hiding their symptoms. They develop coping strategies, they avoid situations that might expose their difficulties, and they protect their loved ones from knowing." She opened the folder and showed Arthur several medical articles. "There's a phenomenon called masking, where patients with early cognitive decline can appear normal in familiar settings with familiar people. Eleanor could have been struggling significantly while still seeming okay to you most of the time." Arthur leaned forward, studying the information. "So I wasn't imagining the changes, but I also wasn't seeing the full extent of what she was dealing with." "Exactly. And Arthur, even if you had recognized the signs, even if you'd insisted on medical evaluation, it wouldn't have changed what happened that night. Electrical fires don't discriminate based on someone's cognitive health." For the first time since Maya had known him, Arthur laughed, not with joy, but with something approaching relief. "Eleanor always said I took on too much responsibility for things outside my control. She used to joke that I thought I was responsible for the weather." Smart woman. She was. God, she was so smart. She would have figured out how to help me. "Through this mess I've made of my life." Maya set down the medical articles. "Arthur, what if I told you that your physical condition, these growths, they've started improving since you learned about Eleanor's letter? Your body is beginning to heal now that you're not carrying quite so much guilt." Arthur touched his face tentatively. "They do feel different, less painful. Trauma manifests physically when we can't process it emotionally. You've been punishing your body for 3 years for something that wasn't your fault. As you start to forgive yourself, your body is starting to heal. The town still believes The town believes what one biased newspaper article told them to believe, but Arthur, you have a choice. You can keep living in service to their misunderstanding, or you can start living for yourself and for Eleanor's memory. Arthur was quiet for a long time. The only sound in the room, the gentle ticking of Eleanor's antique clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, he reached over and turned the key on the music box. Claire de Lune began to play, its delicate melody filling the silence. I used to think playing music again would be betraying Eleanor's memory, he said, like I didn't deserve beauty, when she couldn't experience it anymore. What do you think now? Arthur listened to the melody, his eyes closed. Maybe Eleanor would want me to remember joy, not just sorrow. Maybe that's what love does. It wants the best for people, even after it's gone. When Maya left the cottage that evening, she noticed Arthur had removed the newspaper clipping from his medicine cabinet. Small steps, but in the right direction. Healing rarely happened all at once. It was a series of tiny choices to believe, in hope instead of despair, to trust in love instead of fear. Arthur Henley was finally ready to make those choices, and Maya would be there to support him every step of the way. Arthur's teaching journal lay open on the piano bench where he'd left it 3 years ago, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of use. Maya discovered it during their 4th session at his cottage, when Arthur had finally felt ready to show her the music room that had once been the heart of his life's work. The room was exactly as he'd left it the day after Eleanor's funeral. Sheet music scattered across the piano, chairs arranged in a semicircle for group lessons, a metronome frozen in time on the side table. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that looked out on Eleanor's garden, now overgrown but still beautiful in its wild abandon. I haven't been in here since, Arthur's voice caught. It felt like trespassing on my old life. Maya picked up the journal carefully, its pages filled with Arthur's neat handwriting. Each entry documented a different student, their struggles and breakthroughs, their musical journey and personal growth. She read a few entries aloud. Sarah M., age 16, came to lessons angry and resistant, mother forcing her to play piano as character building. Discovered she responds to blues progressions. Letting her explore jazz has unlocked something. Music isn't about perfection, it's about expression. Marcus T., age 8. Selective mutism at school but hums beautifully at home. Working on building confidence through rhythm exercises. Today he sang Happy Birthday for his sister. Small victories matter most. Mrs. Chen, age 67, retired nurse who always wanted to learn piano. Arthritis makes traditional fingering difficult, but we've adapted techniques. She played Chopin's Minute Waltz today and cried, "Joy has no age limit." Maya looked up at Arthur, who was standing frozen in the doorway. You weren't just teaching music. You were teaching people how to heal. Music was always about more than notes and rhythm for me, Arthur said quietly. Eleanor used to say, I saw music as a language everyone could speak if they just found their own voice. Maya flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry, documenting Arthur's gift for reaching students others had given up on. Troubled teenagers, elderly beginners, children with learning difficulties. Arthur had developed unique approaches for each one, always focusing on what they could do rather than what they couldn't. Listen to this one, Maya said. David R., age 14, parents divorcing, grades dropping, acting out at school, discovered he has natural rhythm for percussion, channeling anger into drum beats, music giving him a safe way to express emotion he can't verbalize. Arthur moved into the room slowly, running his fingers along the piano keys without pressing them. David came to see me about a month before Eleanor died. He'd been accepted to the State Youth Orchestra. I was so proud of him. What happened? To your students after, I cancelled all lessons the week Eleanor died. Told everyone I needed time to grieve. But then weeks turned into months, and I couldn't face coming back in here. The school found substitutes, other teachers took over. My private students. I just disappeared. Maya could hear the regret in his voice, the understanding that his grief had cost him more than just his wife. It had cost him his purpose, his connection to the community, his sense of worth. Arthur, what if some of your former students wanted to reconnect? What if they understood what you were going through? Arthur shook his head. They're better off without me. Look at what I've become. Maya set down the journal and moved to stand beside him at the piano. What I see is a man who spent decades nurturing other people's potential, who helped countless students find their voice through music. That gift doesn't disappear because you're grieving. She pressed middle C, the note hanging in the air between them. When's the last time you played? The night before Eleanor died. We played The Way You Look Tonight. It was our song from our wedding. She was having a good day. Seemed more like herself. I thought maybe whatever had been troubling her was passing. Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. Play it now. I can't. I haven't touched the keys since. Not the whole song. Just a few notes. For Eleanor. Arthur stared at the keyboard for a long moment, then slowly placed his hands in position. His fingers were stiff with disuse and arthritis, but muscle memory guided them to the familiar melody. The opening notes of The Way You Look Tonight filled the dusty room, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Tears streamed down Arthur's face as he played, but he didn't stop. The music seemed to unlock something inside him, releasing 3 years of suppressed emotion. Maya watched the transformation, seeing glimpses of the passionate teacher Arthur had once been. When the last note faded, Arthur sat in silence, his hands still resting on the keys. She would want you to keep playing, Maya said gently. How can you be so sure? Maya picked up the teaching journal again, turning to a page near the back. Because of this, she read aloud. Note to self. Music is the language of healing. When words fail, when hope seems lost, when the world becomes too much to bear, music remains. It connects us to something larger than our pain, reminds us that beauty still exists, even in darkness. This is what I want my students to remember. Music doesn't erase suffering, but it transforms it into something bearable, something shared, something meaningful. Arthur stared at Maya, recognition dawning in his eyes. I wrote that after my mother died. I was struggling with whether to keep teaching, whether I could help others when I was so broken myself. And what did you decide? That broken people sometimes make the best teachers because they understand what it means to need healing. Maya smiled. Your students needed you then because you understood their pain. Maybe now, after everything you've been through, you have even more to offer. Arthur was quiet for a long time, considering this possibility. Finally, he played another few bars of The Way You Look Tonight, his touch growing more confident. There's a letter from Sarah Martinez in my mailbox, he said suddenly. I saw it yesterday but didn't have the courage to open it. She was my most promising student, won the state competition her senior year. What do you think she wants? Probably to tell me how disappointed she is in what I've become. Maya shook her head. Or maybe to tell you how much your teaching meant to her, how it changed her life. Maybe to let you know she's been thinking about you. Arthur looked around the music room, at the instruments gathering dust, the abandoned sheet music, the empty chairs that had once held eager students. For the first time in 3 years, he could imagine filling this space with music again. I'm not ready to teach yet, he said, but maybe I could start by just playing again. For Eleanor, for myself. That sounds like a perfect beginning. As Maya prepared to leave that day, she heard something that made her pause at the front door, the sound of piano music drifting from the back of the house, tentative, rusty, but unmistakably alive. Arthur Henley was finding his way back to himself, one note at a time. Eleanor's wedding ring had lived in a small velvet pouch in Arthur's nightstand drawer for 3 years, too precious to wear, but too painful to put away permanently. The simple gold band represented 40 years of shared mornings, whispered conversations, and quiet devotions that had shaped the rhythm of their life together. Maya discovered its significance during their most difficult session yet, when Arthur finally found the courage to share the complete truth about Eleanor's final days. She stopped wearing it about 2 weeks before the fire, Arthur said, his voice barely audible as he held the tiny pouch. Said it felt too heavy, that her fingers were swelling, but I knew it was more than that. She was already pulling away, preparing for something she couldn't tell me about. They were sitting in his living room, the November afternoon casting long shadows through the windows. Arthur's face showed continued improvement. The brown growths had faded to small patches that were barely noticeable unless you knew to look for them. His transformation was remarkable, but Maya could see he was still carrying the deepest wound of all. "Tell me about those final weeks," Maya said gently. Arthur turned the velvet pouch over in his hands, the weight of the ring inside like a physical presence between them. Eleanor started having what I thought were panic attacks. She'd wake up confused, not knowing where she was for a few seconds. She'd stare at familiar objects like she'd never seen them before. One morning I found her, crying in the kitchen because she couldn't remember how to work the coffee maker. "What did you do?" I made excuses for her, told myself she was just tired, stressed about my increased teaching load at the school. The budget cuts meant I was working longer hours, taking on extra students to make up the difference. I convinced myself that once things settled down, Eleanor would be fine. Maya watched Arthur's face, seeing the self-recrimination he still carried. "Arthur, that sounds like a normal response. When someone we love is struggling, we often look for explanations that feel manageable, but there were signs I ignored." She started asking me the same questions multiple times in one day. She'd lose track of conversations halfway through. She stopped cooking because she said the recipes weren't making sense anymore. I should have insisted she see a doctor. Arthur opened the pouch and carefully removed Eleanor's ring, holding it up to the light. The gold caught the afternoon sun, casting tiny rainbows on the wall. The night before she died, she gave this to me. She was having one of her clearer moments, and she took my hand and pressed the ring into my palm. She said, "Arthur, I need you to keep this safe for me. Promise me you'll remember that I loved you exactly as you were, not as I needed you to be." Maya felt her throat tighten. What did you think she meant? At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Eleanor always had a flair for romantic gestures. But now, Arthur's voice broke. Now I think she was saying goodbye. I think she knew something was seriously wrong, and she was trying to tell me she didn't want me to feel responsible for whatever was coming. "Arthur, let me ask you something that might be difficult to consider. If Eleanor suspected she was developing the same condition that took your mother, how do you think she would have handled that knowledge?" Arthur was quiet for several minutes, turning the ring over in his palm. Maya had learned about his mother's death from Dr. Harrison, a slow, painful decline from Alzheimer's that had lasted 6 years and left Arthur emotionally devastated in his early 30s. "She would have been terrified," Arthur said finally, "not just of the disease itself, but of putting me through that again. I barely survived watching my mother disappear piece by piece. Eleanor knew that. So, if she was experiencing early symptoms, she would have tried to protect me from knowing, even if it meant dealing with her fear alone." Arthur closed his fist around the ring. "Oh, Eleanor, you were still taking care of me, even when you needed taking care of yourself." Maya leaned forward. "Arthur, what Eleanor said about loving you exactly as you were, that wasn't just a romantic sentiment. That was a woman giving you permission to be human, to have limitations, to not be responsible for fixing everything. But I was her husband. It was my job to protect her. From disease, from aging, from the random cruelties of genetics and fate. Arthur, you protected Eleanor in every way that was actually within your power. You loved her completely. You built a beautiful life together, and you honored her final request. Her final request? To let her go. When she was trapped under that beam, and she asked you to stop fighting the inevitable, she wasn't giving up on life. She was giving you permission to stop destroying yourself for something beyond your control." Arthur stared at the ring, and Maya could see him processing this reframing of Eleanor's final words. For 3 years, he'd interpreted "let me go" as Eleanor's disappointment in his rescue efforts. But what if it had been an act of love? A dying woman's final attempt to save her husband from a lifetime of self-blame? The fire department report said the beam that trapped her would have required 3 men to lift, Arthur said slowly. I could never have moved it alone. No, you couldn't have. And Eleanor, knowing what she knew about her own condition, may have seen that impossibility as a mercy rather than a failure. Arthur stood and walked to the window, still holding Eleanor's ring. Outside, her garden was dormant for winter, but Maya could see the structure of what had once been beautiful. Rose bushes pruned back to their essential forms, perennial beds mulched and waiting for spring. I've been so angry with myself for surviving when she didn't, Arthur said. But what if she wanted me to survive? What if everything she did in those final weeks was about ensuring I could live with whatever happened? What do you think? Arthur turned back to Maya, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not just hope, but the beginning of peace. I think Eleanor knew me better than I knew myself. I think she spent our entire marriage showing me how to love without conditions, and her final gift was teaching me how to forgive without reservations. He slipped Eleanor's ring onto his pinky finger, the only finger where it fit. I'm going to wear this again, not as a burden, but as a reminder of love that was real, complete, and worthy of honor. Maya smiled, recognizing the profound shift that had just occurred. Arthur wasn't just healing from his grief, he was transforming it into something that could nourish rather than destroy. There's something else, Arthur said, reaching for an envelope on the side table. That letter from Sarah Martinez I mentioned. I finally opened it yesterday. He handed Maya the letter and she read the first few lines. Dear Mr. Henley, I hope this finds you well. I know it's been 3 years since Mrs. Henley's passing, and I should have written sooner. I want you to know that your lessons didn't just teach me music. They taught me that broken things can still create beauty, that healing happens one note at a time, and that the best teachers are the ones who understand pain. Maya looked up at Arthur, seeing tears in his eyes, but for the first time since she'd known him, they looked like tears of gratitude rather than grief. She wants to visit, Arthur said. She's a music therapist now, working with trauma patients. She says I inspired her career choice. What did you tell her? Arthur touched Eleanor's ring on his finger, drawing strength from its familiar weight. I told her to come home. It's time to start teaching again. Maya found the medical records by accident, tucked inside a cookbook that Arthur had asked her to retrieve from Eleanor's kitchen. They were having tea after his most successful session yet. He'd played piano for 30 minutes straight, working through pieces that had once been muscle memory, his fingers slowly remembering their purpose. The brown growths on his face had faded to barely visible marks, and his posture had straightened with newfound confidence. Eleanor always kept important papers in the strangest places, Arthur had said, laughing as Maya pulled out a folder from between Joy of Cooking and Better Homes and Gardens cookbook. She said filing cabinets were too obvious. What if someone broke in? Maya had smiled at the quirk, but her expression changed as she opened the folder. Inside were medical records from Dr. Patricia Brennan, a neurologist in the next town over. The dates made her heart skip, all from the week before Eleanor's death. Arthur, Maya said carefully, did Eleanor ever mention seeing Dr. Brennan? Arthur looked up from the piano bench where he'd been organizing sheet music. Who? Maya handed him the folder, watching his face transform as he read the letterhead. She did see a doctor. The appointment she mentioned in her letter to Margaret, she actually went. Arthur's hands trembled as he read the documents. Maya watched him process the neurologist's findings. Comprehensive cognitive testing, brain scans, detailed analysis of Eleanor's symptoms. And at the bottom of the final report, the diagnosis that changed everything: early-stage Alzheimer's disease, consistent with genetic predisposition and presenting symptoms. She knew. Arthur whispered. She had a diagnosis, and she never told me. Maya moved to sit beside him on the piano bench. Keep reading. Arthur turned the page to find a letter Eleanor had written to Dr. Brennan, but apparently never sent. Dear Dr. Brennan, thank you for your compassion during yesterday's appointment. Your diagnosis, while frightening, at least gives a name to what I've been experiencing. However, after much consideration, I have decided not to share this information with my husband at this time. Arthur's mother died from Alzheimer's after a 6-year decline that nearly destroyed him emotionally. He has just taken on additional teaching responsibilities to help with our finances, and he's been worried about my recent episodes. As it is, I believe telling him now would cause him to sacrifice everything to become my caregiver, and I cannot bear to watch him lose himself to my disease the way he lost himself to his mother's. I plan to tell him when the time is right, when he's stronger, when I have a better understanding of how quickly this will progress. For now, I want to protect the beautiful life we've built together for as long as possible. Please keep this confidential until I'm ready to involve Arthur in treatment decisions. Arthur read the letter twice, his breathing becoming shallow. Maya watched him carefully, ready to intervene if he became overwhelmed. She was protecting me, he said finally, even from her own diagnosis. Arthur, there's more, Maya pointed to another document, a treatment plan Dr. Brennan had developed, including medications that might slow Eleanor's cognitive decline and support groups for both patients and spouses. Eleanor had scheduled a follow-up appointment for the week after the fire occurred, but it was the final document that completely recontextualized everything Arthur believed about that terrible night. A note from Dr. Brennan's office, marked Emergency. Protocol. Patient Eleanor Henley called the emergency line at 11:47 p.m. on the night of her death. She reported being confused and disoriented, unable to recognize her surroundings despite being in her own home. During the brief conversation, she mentioned smelling something burning, but couldn't identify the source. The call was disconnected. Abruptly, given her recent diagnosis and the late hour, I attempted to call back but received no answer. Per protocol, I contacted emergency services to request a wellness check at 11:52 p.m. Arthur stared at the document, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The fire department said they received a call about the fire at 11:55 p.m., but they never knew who called it in. Eleanor called Dr. Brennan for help when she became confused. The doctor called for the wellness check that brought the fire department to your house. But that means, Arthur's voice caught, Eleanor wasn't just a victim of the fire, she was trying to get help. Even in her confusion, she knew something was wrong. Maya felt her own emotions rising. Arthur, Eleanor's final words to you. Let me go, I'm tired. They weren't about giving up. They were about a woman who had just spent her last moments of clarity trying to save both of you. Arthur stood and walked to the window, staring out at Eleanor's garden. She called for help. Even when she was scared and confused, she was still trying to take care of us. And when she realized the fire was too advanced, when she understood that the beam had her trapped, she made one final choice: to save you from a lifetime of guilt and self-destruction. Arthur turned back to Maya, tears streaming down his face. But for the first time since she'd known him, they looked like tears of relief rather than anguish. I've been carrying the wrong story for 3 years, he said. I thought Eleanor died because I failed her. But she died trying to save us both. First, by keeping her diagnosis private to protect me, then by calling for help when the fire started, and finally, by giving me permission to let go when the situation became hopeless. Maya nodded. Eleanor spent her final months, her final moments, loving you the only way she knew how, by putting your well-being above her own fear. Arthur returned to the piano and played a few bars of Claire de Lune, the melody Eleanor had loved so much. This time, his touch was gentle but strong, filled with wonder rather than sorrow. The town has been wrong about everything, he said. They've been judging me for failing to save a woman who was actually trying to save me. But Arthur, does it matter what the town thinks now? You know the truth. You know Eleanor's love was complete and unconditional. You know you did everything humanly possible. Arthur played another passage, his fingers finding their strength. It matters because there might be other people suffering the way I've been. Suffering. Other people carrying guilt for things beyond their control. If Eleanor's story could help them, what are you thinking? Arthur closed the piano and turned to face Maya fully. I'm thinking it's time to tell the truth, all of it. Eleanor's diagnosis, her attempts to protect me, her final actions to get help. People need to understand what really happened that night. Maya felt a chill of concern. Arthur, that's a big step. Once you share Eleanor's private medical information, you can't take it back. Are you sure you're ready for that? Arthur picked up the medical records, holding them like the precious artifacts they were, proof of Eleanor's courage, her love, her final gift to him. Eleanor kept these secrets to protect me, but I think she'd understand that now I need to share them to heal, not just myself, but maybe others who are carrying similar burdens. He moved to his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. I'm going to write a letter to the newspaper, the same paper that published that awful article 3 years ago. I'm going to tell them Eleanor's real story. Maya watched Arthur begin to write, his handwriting steady and sure. She realized she was witnessing something profound, a man choosing truth over comfort, courage over safety, love over fear. What will you tell them? She asked. Arthur paused in his writing, looking up with eyes that held no trace of the shame she'd seen when they first met. I'm going to tell them about a woman who faced her greatest fear alone to protect the man she loved. I'm going to tell them about love so complete that it chose sacrifice over burden, hope over despair, truth over comfortable lies. I'm going to tell them that Eleanor Henley died exactly the way she lived, putting others before herself, finding strength in the face of fear and loving without conditions. Arthur returned to his letter, and Maya understood that everything was about to change, not just for Arthur, but for the entire community that had spent 3 years living with a lie when the truth was so much more beautiful and heartbreaking than they could have imagined. The community petition arrived at Arthur's door on a grey December morning, carried by Sarah Martinez, his former student who had grown into a confident woman of 28, with kind eyes that reminded him of Eleanor. Sarah stood on his porch, holding a thick folder, her breath visible in the cold air, nervously shifting from foot to foot. "Mr. Henley," she said when Arthur opened the door, "I hope I'm not imposing. I know you said I could visit, but I brought something that couldn't." "Wait." Arthur invited her into the warm cottage, noticing how her eyes lingered on the music room, visible through the open doorway. The piano bench was no longer pushed against the wall, and sheet music was scattered across the top in organized chaos, signs of recent use that made Sarah smile. "You're playing again," she observed. "Thanks to someone who reminded me that broken things can still create beauty," Arthur replied, echoing the words Sarah had written in her letter. Sarah set the folder on the coffee table next to Eleanor's music box. "Mr. Henley, I need to tell you something. Your letter to the newspaper, it's changed everything." Arthur's letter had been published 2 weeks earlier, taking up the entire opinion page of the Millbrook Herald. In it, he had shared Eleanor's diagnosis, her secret attempts to protect him, and the true events of that terrible night. The response from the community had been swift and overwhelming. "People are talking," Sarah continued, "really talking for the first time in 3 years, about grief, about how we treat people who are suffering, about what really happened to you and Mrs. Henley." She opened the folder to reveal dozens of signatures on an official document. "We've been working on this for the past week. Former students, colleagues from the school, parents of kids you taught, community members who remember what you meant to this town before." "What is it?" Arthur asked, though his heart was already racing. "It's a petition to the school board, requesting that you be offered a position developing a new therapeutic music program. But it's more than that. It's an apology." a formal acknowledgement that this community failed you when you needed support most. Arthur read the petition's opening paragraph. "We, the undersigned members of the Millbrook community, formally request that Arthur Henley be invited to return to educational service in a capacity that honors both his exceptional gifts as a music educator and his profound understanding of healing through artistic expression. We acknowledge that our community's response to Mr. Henley's tragedy was inadequate and often cruel. We failed to offer support during his darkest hour, instead choosing judgment over compassion. We now understand the full truth of Eleanor Henley's courage and Arthur Henley's devotion, and we seek to make amends for our collective failure of empathy." Arthur's hands shook as he turned the pages, seeing name after name, people who had crossed streets to avoid him, neighbors who had whispered behind their hands, former colleagues who had acted as if he didn't exist. But also names that surprised him, parents of current students who had only heard of his reputation, young adults who remembered childhood piano lessons, elderly community members who recalled concerts he had organized decades ago. "There are over 300 signatures," Sarah said quietly. "Mr. Henley, this entire town has been carrying guilt about how they treated you. Your letter gave them permission to face that guilt and try to make it right." Arthur found his own eyes filling with tears, a regular occurrence these days, but no longer tears of shame. "I never expected, I wrote the letter to honor Eleanor, not to get your life back," Sarah interrupted gently. "Mr. Henley, you gave so much to this community for decades. You deserve to have that investment returned when you need it most." Arthur walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd lived for 35 years. For the first time in 3 years, he could imagine belonging here again. "There's something else," Sarah said. "The petition isn't just about offering you a job. It's about creating something new, a music therapy program that would serve the entire region. Trauma patients, grief counselors, support groups, elderly care facilities. Your experience with loss, combined with your musical expertise, could help hundreds of people." Arthur turned back to Sarah, seeing the excitement in her face. "You've really thought this through. We've been planning for months, actually. Ever since I moved back to town and saw what had happened to you, I knew the Arthur Henley I remembered wouldn't just disappear, that somehow you'd find your way back to helping people. Your letter confirmed what I suspected. You've been learning how to heal yourself, which means you're ready to help others heal too." Sarah pulled out another document, a detailed proposal for the therapeutic music program. Arthur read through it with growing amazement. The program would be housed at the clinic, with satellite locations at the high school, the community center, and the regional hospital. It would offer individual and group sessions, train other music therapists, and provide resources for families dealing with various forms of trauma and loss. Maya Rodriguez has been invaluable in developing the medical protocols, Sarah explained. She's been advocating for you with the hospital administration, the school board, even the town council. Mr. Henley, you have more supporters than you realize. Arthur felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was emotion rather than anxiety. Maya never mentioned. She said it wasn't her place to get your hopes up until we knew the community was truly ready to make amends. But Mr. Henley, we're ready to support you the way we should have 3 years ago. Arthur set down the proposal, overwhelmed by the scope of what his former student was describing. Sarah, this sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something this public, this significant. Sarah smiled. Mr. Henley, do you remember what you used to tell us when we were afraid to perform? You'd say, the music doesn't belong to you. You're just the vessel. Your job isn't to be perfect. It's to let the beauty through. Arthur remembered. Saying those words, remembered believing them completely. That seems like a lifetime ago. It was a different lifetime, but you're still the same person who helped me find my voice when I thought I was worthless. You're still the teacher who showed Marcus how to overcome his selective mutism through music. You're still the man who created a safe space for dozens of troubled kids to express their pain and find healing. Sarah reached across the coffee table and touched Arthur's hand. The difference is that now you understand pain from the inside. That doesn't make you less qualified to help others. It makes you more qualified. Arthur looked at Eleanor's music box, then at the petition, then at Sarah's earnest face. What would Eleanor think about all this? I think she'd be proud that her sacrifice led to something beautiful. I think she'd love knowing that her story helped people understand the difference between giving up and letting go, between abandoning someone and setting them free. Arthur was quiet for a long time, processing everything Sarah had shared, the physical manifestations of his grief, the brown growths that had marked him as an outcast, had almost completely disappeared. His body had healed as his understanding had deepened, but this proposal would require him to step fully back into the world, to risk being seen and judged and potentially hurt again. There's one more thing, Sarah said, reaching into the folder one final time. The school board meets tomorrow night to discuss the proposal. They've asked if you'd be willing to speak on your own behalf. Arthur felt his stomach clench. In public? In front of the whole community? Maya will be there too. She's facing a professional review board hearing about her treatment methods with you. Some people have questioned whether her unconventional approach was appropriate. Your testimony could help validate her methods and secure approval for the music therapy program. Arthur understood immediately. Maya had risked her professional reputation to help him heal. She'd shown him compassion when the rest of the world had shown him judgment. She'd believed in his recovery when he didn't believe in it himself. Now she needed him to return that support. Maya's in trouble because of me? Maya's facing questions. Because she dared to see past your condition to your humanity. Because she treated you like a person worthy of healing instead of a lost cause to be managed. The medical establishment doesn't always understand that kind of holistic care. Arthur stood and walked to his piano, pressing the keys that had remained. Silent for 3 years, until Maya had encouraged him to play again. The notes rang clear and true, filling the cottage with the sound of possibility. If I testify tomorrow night, he said, I'll be telling the whole town about Eleanor's diagnosis, about my own breakdown, about everything Maya did to help me rebuild my life. Yes. Arthur played a few bars of The Way You Look Tonight, the song he and Eleanor had shared, the melody that now represented healing rather than loss. Sarah, what if I'm not ready? What if I break down in front of everyone? Sarah joined him at the piano, sitting beside him on the bench, the way she had during lessons 15 years ago. Then you break down, and then you keep going. That's what you taught me about music, about life, that the beauty isn't in the perfection, it's in the courage to keep playing, even when your hands are shaking, even when you miss a note, even when you're afraid. Arthur looked at the petition one more time, at all those signatures representing a community ready to embrace rather than exile him. Eleanor would want me to help Maya. Eleanor would want you to help yourself. And in helping yourself, you'll help others. Maya, the students who need what you have to offer, the community that needs to learn how to show compassion. Arthur closed the piano and turned to Sarah with a resolve he hadn't felt in 3 years. Tell the school board I'll be there tomorrow night. Tell them I'm ready to come home. The community center had never held so many people on a December evening. Arthur arrived 30 minutes early, hoping to slip in unnoticed, but found the parking lot already full and a line of people waiting to enter the building. He sat in his car for several minutes, watching his neighbors, people who had avoided him for 3 years, filing into the meeting that would determine both his future and Maya's career. His hands trembled as he reached for the manila folder. On his passenger seat, inside, was Maria Santos's testimonial letter, which had arrived that morning along with dozens of others from former students around the country. Maria's letter had moved him to tears. Dear Mr. Henley, you probably don't remember me. I was in your beginner piano class 15 years ago, a scared kid from a broken home who could barely speak above a whisper. My parents were divorcing. My grades were failing, and I had convinced myself I was worthless. Then I walked into your music room. You never treated me like I was damaged goods. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. When I was too shy to play in front of others, you created private recital opportunities. When I couldn't afford sheet music, you photocopied pieces and told me they were classroom copies. When I cried during lessons because of problems at home, you just handed me tissues and said, "Music understands everything, Maria. Let it speak." For you, today I'm Dr. Maria Santos, a licensed therapist specializing in trauma recovery through expressive arts. Every technique I use, every breakthrough I witness, every life I help rebuild, it all traces back to a music teacher who showed me that broken people could still create beauty. You saved my life, Mr. Henley. Now let me help save yours. Arthur folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder with the others. Stories from students who had overcome selective mutism, depression, family trauma, learning disabilities, and addiction. All of them crediting Arthur's patient, unconventional teaching methods with providing the foundation for their healing. He looked up to see Maya approaching his car, her expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. She wore her best professional outfit, but Arthur could see the worry in her eyes. "Ready for this?" she asked as he rolled down his window. "Are you?" Maya managed a small smile. "I've been a nurse for 25 years, Arthur. I've seen every kind of medical emergency, dealt with every type of difficult situation. But I've never had to defend caring too much for a patient." Arthur got out of his car and stood beside Maya in the cold evening air. The community center was brightly lit, warm yellow light spilling from its windows onto the frost-covered ground. "Maya, I need you to know, whatever happens in there tonight, you saved my life, not just from the growths or the isolation, but from believing I was beyond redemption. Arthur, you saved yourself. I just reminded you that healing was possible." They walked toward the building together, Arthur acutely aware of the people who turned to look at him. But something had changed. Where once he saw disgust or fear in their faces, now he saw curiosity, recognition, even what looked like shame. His letter to the newspaper had shifted something fundamental in how the community saw him. Inside, the meeting room was packed beyond capacity. The school board sat at a long table at the front, their faces serious but not unkind. Dr. Harrison from the clinic was there, along with several other medical professionals Arthur didn't recognize. In the audience, he spotted Sarah Martinez sitting in the front row next to an elderly man he suddenly recognized as his former principal, Robert Matthews. Arthur took a seat in the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous until his name was called. Maya sat beside him, her professional composure intact despite the personal stakes of the evening. School board president Janet Morrison, the same Janet who had been Arthur's student decades ago, called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address two interconnected matters: the proposed therapeutic music program for our district and a professional review of Nurse Maya Rodriguez's treatment methods. We'll begin with testimony regarding Ms. Rodriguez's approach to patient care." Dr. Harrison stood first, his testimony clinical and measured. "Ms. Rodriguez has shown excellent technical skills and medical knowledge. However, some of her methods, particularly her extended engagement with certain difficult cases, have raised questions about professional boundaries and resource allocation." Arthur watched Maya's face remain composed, but he knew her well enough now to see the tension around her eyes. "The concern," Dr. Harrison continued, "is whether Ms. Rodriguez's emotional investment in her patients represents compassionate care or unprofessional over-involvement. There's a fine line between helping someone heal and enabling dependence." Several other medical professionals spoke, their comments ranging from supportive to skeptical. Arthur found himself growing angry at the suggestion that Maya's extraordinary compassion was somehow a professional failing. Finally, Janet Morrison looked toward the back of the room. "We'd like to hear from Arthur Henley, the patient whose care has been central to this review." Arthur stood on unsteady legs, aware that every eye in the room was now focused on him. He made his way to the front, carrying Maria's letter and the testimonial from the dozens of other former students who had credited him with changing their lives. As he reached the microphone, Arthur looked out at the packed room, at faces he'd known for decades, at former students now grown into adults, at neighbors who had once crossed streets to avoid him. For the first time in 3 years, he stood before his community not as an outcast, but as a man ready to tell his truth. "My name is Arthur Henley," he began, his voice stronger than he'd expected. 3 years ago, I lost my wife, Eleanor, in a house fire. What I'm here to tell you tonight is how Maya Rodriguez saved my life and why her methods represent the very best of what medical care should be. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and carefully withdrew the small cassette recorder he'd brought with him, along with the tape that had lived in his nightstand drawer for 3 years. The room fell completely silent as he set the device. On the podium, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to share. "Before I tell you about Maya Rodriguez's extraordinary care," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "I need you to understand what my wife Eleanor and I were facing in the months before she died. I need you to hear Eleanor's voice." He pressed play, and suddenly the community center was filled with the sound of piano music. Arthur and Eleanor playing "The Way You Look Tonight" together. Eleanor's voice joined in, singing softly, her tone warm and loving, despite the slight tremor that hinted at her underlying condition. This was recorded on our 35th wedding anniversary, just 6 weeks before Eleanor died, Arthur said as the music played. "What you're hearing is a woman who knew she was losing herself to Alzheimer's disease, choosing to create one last beautiful memory with the man she'd loved for 4 decades. Gasps rippled through the audience. Arthur saw shock, understanding, and deep sadness on the faces before him. In the front row, Sarah Martinez was crying openly. Arthur let the music play for another moment before turning off the recorder. "Eleanor kept her diagnosis secret to protect me. She knew I'd watched my mother die from the same disease, and she couldn't bear to put me through that again. So she carried her terror alone, made her own medical appointments, and tried to shield me from knowledge she thought would destroy me." He looked directly at Dr. Harrison. "The night Eleanor died, she called her neurologist's emergency line because she was confused and disoriented. Dr. Brennan's office contacted emergency services, which is how the fire department knew to come to our house, even in her final moments. Of clarity, Eleanor was trying to save both of us." Arthur paused, gathering his strength for what came next. "For 3 years I believed I had failed Eleanor. I believed her final words, 'Let me go, I'm tired,' meant she had given up on life because I wasn't worth saving. The guilt manifested physically in growths that covered my face, marking me as surely as if I'd worn a scarlet letter. This community saw those marks and decided I was guilty of something they couldn't quite name. The room was absolutely still. Arthur could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 300 people hanging on his every word. Maya Rodriguez looked at me and saw past the physical symptoms to the wounded human being underneath. She didn't just treat my condition, she treated my spirit. She helped me understand that love sometimes means letting go, that Eleanor's final request wasn't about giving up, but about setting me free from impossible guilt." Arthur opened the manila folder and held up Maria Santos's letter. "Maya's methods saved more than just me. Her approach, treating the whole person, not just the symptoms, is exactly what I used to do as a music teacher. When students came to me broken, I didn't just teach them scales and timing. I helped them find their voice, their worth, their capacity to create beauty despite their pain." He began reading from Maria's letter, his voice strong and clear. "You saved my life, Mr. Henley. You showed me that broken people could still create beauty. Today, I'm Dr. Maria Santos, a licensed therapist specializing in trauma recovery through expressive arts." Arthur looked up from the letter. I received 37 letters like this in the past month. 37 former students who credit their healing, their careers, their ability to help others, to lessons learned in my music room decades ago. Maya Rodriguez used the same holistic approach with me, and it worked. He turned to address the medical board directly. "You're concerned about professional boundaries?" Maya maintained perfect clinical objectivity while showing me the human compassion. "I needed to survive." "You're worried about resource allocation?" Maya invested time in one broken man and helped restore someone who can now help hundreds of others through therapeutic music programs. Arthur moved closer to the microphone. "Maya Rodriguez didn't enable my dependence. She enabled my independence. She didn't overstep professional boundaries. She reminded me that healing requires both medical expertise and human connection. She didn't waste resources. She invested in a human life that everyone else had written off as lost." The room erupted in spontaneous applause. Arthur saw school board members wiping their eyes, medical professionals nodding in understanding, community members who had shunned him now rising to their feet. When the applause died down, Arthur spoke directly to Maya, who was sitting with tears streaming down her face. "Maya, you gave me back my life, my purpose, and my connection to this community. You showed me that Eleanor's love was complete and unconditional, and that her final gift was freeing me to heal and help others heal." He turned back to the room. "The question tonight isn't whether Maya Rodriguez's methods are appropriate. It's whether we're brave enough to support the kind of compassionate care that transforms lives. The question is whether this community is ready to choose healing over judgment, hope over fear, love over comfortable distance." Arthur gathered his materials and stepped back from the podium. "Maya Rodriguez saved my life using the same principles that guided my teaching for 30 years. Now I'm asking you to let us work together to save others." The standing ovation that followed lasted for 5 full minutes, and Arthur finally understood what Eleanor had been trying to tell him in her final moments. Sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love, and sometimes the deepest healing comes from the courage to trust in human goodness despite our deepest fears. 6 months later, Arthur stood in the newly dedicated Eleanor Henley Memorial Music Therapy Center, watching Maya lead a group session with trauma survivors. The space had been carved out of the clinic's east wing, with soundproofed rooms, adjustable lighting, and a magnificent grand piano donated by the community in Eleanor's honor. Sunlight streamed through large windows that looked out onto Eleanor's garden, a memorial space Arthur had designed with Maya's help, featuring the roses and lavender Eleanor had loved, along with benches where patients could sit and reflect. The scene, new music program proposal lay open on Arthur's desk, its pages filled with treatment protocols he and Maya had developed together. The document represented months of collaboration, combining Maya's medical expertise with Arthur's understanding of how music could heal emotional wounds. They had created something unprecedented, a comprehensive therapeutic program that treated patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms. "Mr. Henley," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see 16-year-old Emma Walsh, one of his first music therapy patients, holding her violin case with trembling hands. "Ready for your session, Emma?" Emma nodded, though Arthur could see the anxiety in her face. She'd been referred to the program after a car accident that had killed her best friend, survivor's guilt that manifested in panic attacks, and an inability to concentrate in school. Traditional therapy had helped somewhat, but Emma's parents had hoped music might reach parts of her healing that words couldn't touch. "I brought the piece we've been working on," Emma said, opening her case to reveal a violin that had belonged to her grandmother. "The Bach partita. I think I'm ready to play it all the way through." Arthur smiled, remembering his early days teaching Sarah Martinez, Maria Santos, and dozens of other students who had walked into his music room carrying invisible wounds. "Let's see what the music has to tell us today." They moved into the main In therapy room, where Maya was just finishing her session with the trauma group, Arthur watched her work, still amazed by her ability to create safe spaces for people to process their deepest pain. The medical board's investigation had concluded with a formal commendation for her innovative approach, and she'd been asked to develop training protocols for other healthcare providers. As the group members filed out, each one stopped to thank Maya for the session. Arthur noticed how different they looked from when they'd first arrived, shoulders straighter, eyes brighter, voices stronger. Healing was rarely linear, but these people were clearly finding their way back to themselves. "How did it go, Arthur?" asked Maya as Emma set up her music stand. "Better than I hoped. Mrs. Patterson finally talked about losing her son in Afghanistan. She's been carrying that grief for 5 years, letting it manifest as chronic pain and insomnia. Today, she said she could imagine sleeping peacefully again." Arthur nodded, understanding the connection between unprocessed grief and physical symptoms all too well. His own face bore no trace of the brown growths that had once marked him. They had faded completely as he'd learned to forgive himself and embrace the truth of Eleanor's love. Emma began to play the Bach partita, her bow moving across the strings. With growing confidence, the melody filled the room with beauty that spoke directly to the heart, bypassing the mind's defenses and touching places where words couldn't reach. Arthur watched Maya's face soften as the music washed over her, remembering her own husband David, her own journey through grief and back to life. When Emma finished, she was crying, not from sadness, but from the relief of expressing emotions. Too complex for language. "I felt Sarah with me while I played," she said, referring to her friend who had died. "Not like she was gone, but like she was helping me remember how to be okay again." Arthur handed Emma a tissue, the same gesture Maya had made for him during their first real session together. "Music is the language we use when regular words aren't enough. Sarah would want you to keep playing, keep growing, keep finding reasons to create beauty in the world." After Emma left, Arthur and Maya walked through Eleanor's garden, checking on the late spring blooms. The roses Eleanor had planted decades ago were thriving under Maya's careful attention, their fragrance mixing with the salt air from the nearby ocean. "I have news," Maya said, as they settled on one of the memorial benches. "The State Medical Board wants us to present our program at their annual conference. They're considering it as a model for other rural communities." Arthur felt a familiar flutter of nervousness, but it was different now, excitement rather than fear. Eleanor would be amazed to know her story was helping people across the state. "She'd be proud of you," Maya said simply. "Proud of how you've turned your pain into purpose, how you've used your own healing to help others heal." Arthur looked out at the garden, at the clinic where Maya continued her revolutionary approach to patient care, at the town that had learned to choose compassion over judgment. "I used to think Eleanor's death was the end of our story together. Now I understand it was a transformation, our love changing from something we shared privately to something that could heal others." Maya touched his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the months of their partnership. "Arthur, do you remember what you told Emma about music being the language we use when words aren't enough?" "Yes, I think love works the same way. Eleanor's love for you didn't end when she died. It just found new ways to express itself. Through your teaching, through this program, through every person you help find their voice again." Arthur smiled, feeling Eleanor's presence not as a ghost haunting his guilt, but as a continuing influence encouraging his growth. "Maya, what do you think comes next for us, for the program?" Maya looked at the roses, at the clinic, at the man who had become not just her patient but her partner in healing others. "I think we keep doing what Eleanor and David would want us to do. We keep choosing love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation. We keep proving that broken people can not only heal, but can become sources of healing for others." As evening settled over Millbrook, Arthur and Maya walked back toward the clinic, where tomorrow would bring new patients, new stories of pain seeking transformation into beauty. Behind them, Eleanor's garden glowed in the golden light, a living testament to love's power to endure, transform, and create new life even in the face of seemingly insurmountable loss. Sometimes the deepest healing comes not from forgetting our pain, but from learning how to let that pain become a source of compassion for others. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that continue long after the final goodbye, expressed through the lives we touch and the hope we choose to nurture in a world that desperately needs both.